The war in Ukraine has entered a phase where sweeping offensives and dramatic breakthroughs have given way to something quieter, more methodical, and in many ways more consequential. What is shifting the balance on parts of the front is not a revolutionary weapon or a sudden collapse of morale, but a deceptively simple battlefield method. This method is forcing Russian forces to relearn how to hold ground under constant pressure. Across contested sectors, Ukrainian units are combining small-scale infiltration, persistent drone reconnaissance, and relentless localized probing attacks. Their goal is to fracture defensive cohesion rather than smash it outright. The result is a pattern of gradual ruptures. These ruptures, taken together, threaten to undermine Russia's ability to stabilize its extended front line. What appears at first glance to be tactical improvisation is in fact reshaping operational dynamics across the war. For most of the conflict, the war has been defined by massed artillery, trench networks, and fortified defensive belts stretching across eastern and southern Ukraine. Russia's strategy since late 2022 has relied heavily on constructing layered defensive systems designed to absorb Ukrainian assaults, slow momentum, and buy time for reinforcements. These fortifications, stretching from the Donbass to the Black Sea coast, were intended to lock the front into a static contest of attrition. The assumption in Moscow was that Ukraine, lacking manpower and armored mass, would exhaust itself trying to punch through prepared lines. Yet what is unfolding now is not a frontal assault on these defenses, but a systematic erosion of their integrity. The method Ukrainian forces are increasingly employing hinges on precision observation and constant pressure at multiple weak points. Small infantry teams, often operating at night and guided by real-time drone feeds, probe forward into gaps between Russian positions. These incursions rarely aim to seize large swaths of territory immediately. Instead, they seek to create uncertainty, force local withdrawals, and compel Russian units to redeploy reserves. This gradually thins their defensive density. The effect is cumulative. A trench abandoned here, a forward observation post lost there, a supply route intermittently disrupted elsewhere. Each small disruption increases the strain on Russian command structures, responsible for maintaining continuity along the front. Drones play a central role in enabling this approach. Ukraine's widespread deployment of inexpensive quadcopters and modified commercial UAVs has turned the battlefield into a nearly transparent environment. Russian movements that once could be concealed by darkness or terrain are now routinely detected, tracked, and targeted. This persistent surveillance means that Ukrainian units can identify where Russian defenses are thin, where rotations are delayed, and where logistics falter. Instead of attacking the strongest point in the line, they exploit the weakest and return repeatedly until the position becomes untenable. Over time, this transforms the front line from a rigid barrier into a series of stress points, vulnerable to incremental collapse. For Russian forces, the challenge is not merely tactical but structural. Russia's military doctrine has historically emphasized depth, artillery dominance, and centralized command. These principles function effectively in large-scale maneuver warfare or in defensive battles where lines remain stable and predictable. But they are less suited to a situation in which small Ukrainian elements continuously penetrate shallow positions, withdraw, and return elsewhere. Each penetration forces local commanders to decide whether to counterattack, reinforce, or fall back. When such decisions occur simultaneously across dozens of sectors, coordination becomes difficult and the risk of overextension grows. The Ukrainian approach also leverages mobility and dispersion. Rather than massing troops in visible formations, Ukrainian forces increasingly operate in decentralized groups capable of acting independently while remaining connected through digital communications networks. This allows them to exploit fleeting opportunities quickly. If a Russian position appears under strength, Ukrainian teams can converge rapidly, apply pressure, and then disperse again before heavy artillery or aviation can respond. The goal is not to destroy Russian forces outright, but to compel them into a reactive posture, where they are constantly responding rather than shaping events. This strategy reflects lessons learned over 2 years of intense combat. Early in the war, Ukraine relied heavily on defensive resilience, and later on attempts at large-scale counteroffensives that encountered dense minefields and entrenched positions. Those experiences demonstrated the high cost of traditional breakthrough operations against prepared defenses. The shift toward persistent micro-offensives represents an adaptation born of necessity. It acknowledges the realities of modern surveillance, the lethality of precision artillery, and the constraints of manpower. Instead of seeking a single decisive breakthrough, Ukraine is attempting to create many small fractures that collectively alter the operational picture. From a technological standpoint, the simplicity of the approach is precisely what makes it effective. Commercial drones costing a fraction of a missile system can locate targets, guide artillery, and assess battle damage within minutes. Lightweight communications equipment allows dispersed units to coordinate without relying on vulnerable centralized hubs. Improvised electronic warfare tools disrupt Russian drone feeds and radio traffic, further complicating situational awareness. None of these elements alone constitutes a revolutionary innovation, but their integration into a coherent method of constant probing and localized pressure is proving disruptive to Russia's defensive model. Russia is adapting as well, attempting to increase drone production, expand electronic warfare coverage, and rotate units more frequently to maintain defensive density. Yet these measures come with trade-offs. Reinforcing one sector weakens another. Increasing electronic warfare emissions can reveal positions to Ukrainian signals intelligence. Rotating units more often strains logistics and command continuity. The Russian military size provides resilience, but its scale also creates inertia, making rapid, flexible responses harder to implement across a front that stretches hundreds of kilometers. The psychological dimension of this Ukrainian tactic is equally significant. Soldiers holding defensive positions under constant low-level pressure experience a different kind of stress than those facing periodic large assaults. Instead of preparing for a single decisive battle, they confront continuous uncertainty. Nighttime infiltrations, sudden drone strikes, and sporadic artillery corrections create a sense that the front is never fully secure. Over time, this can degrade morale and increase the likelihood of local withdrawals, especially among units already stretched thin or composed of recently mobilized personnel. Strategically, this gradual destabilization of Russian lines serves a broader purpose. Ukraine does not necessarily need to achieve a rapid territorial breakthrough to alter the course of the war. By forcing Russia to commit reserves continuously, it can reduce Moscow's ability to concentrate forces for its own offensives. Each Russian battalion shifted to plug a defensive gap is one less available for a new push elsewhere. In this way, Ukraine's localized pressure acts as a form of operational containment, limiting Russia's initiative while preserving Ukraine's own flexibility. The geopolitical implications extend beyond the battlefield. Sustained Ukrainian success in eroding Russian defenses strengthens Kyiv's position in negotiations over military aid and diplomatic support. Western partners evaluating the effectiveness of their assistance often look for evidence that Ukrainian forces can translate resources into tangible battlefield results. Incremental advances achieved through adaptive tactics demonstrate that Ukraine remains capable of contesting territory despite the war's prolonged nature. This perception influences decisions in capitals across Europe and North America, where debates over funding and weapons deliveries continue. For Russia, the erosion of frontline stability complicates its strategic narrative. Moscow has portrayed the war as increasingly under control, emphasizing defensive fortifications and gradual territorial gains. Persistent Ukrainian penetrations undermine that message, suggesting that the front remains fluid and contested. This carries domestic implications, particularly as Russia balances military demands with economic pressures and the need to sustain public support for a long conflict. Economically, the continuation of such grinding warfare reinforces the war's status as a test of industrial endurance. Ukraine's reliance on inexpensive drones and decentralized tactics reduces its dependence on large quantities of heavy equipment, which are harder to replace. Russia, meanwhile, must continue to invest heavily in artillery production, fortification construction, and troop rotations. The asymmetry in costs favors Ukraine's approach in the short term. as it can impose disproportionate strain on Russian logistics with relatively modest resources. The international dimension is also shaped by how this phase of the war is perceived. If Ukraine demonstrates that adaptive tactics can steadily erode Russian control, it reinforces the argument that sustained support can eventually produce meaningful strategic gains. This affects policy discussions within organizations like NATO and the European Union, where long-term security planning increasingly treats the war not as a temporary crisis, but as a defining element of Europe's strategic landscape. Within Ukraine itself, the emphasis on flexible, locally driven operations reflects a broader evolution in military culture. The Ukrainian armed forces have increasingly embraced decentralized decision-making, empowering junior officers and non-commissioned leaders to act on real-time intelligence. This contrasts with the more hierarchical structure traditionally associated with Russian command. The ability to exploit fleeting opportunities on the battlefield often depends less on formal doctrine than on the initiative of small unit leaders who understand both the terrain and the enemy's patterns. Historically, wars often reach turning points not through singular decisive battles, but through shifts in operational method that gradually favor one side. The attritional campaigns of the 20th century repeatedly demonstrated that adaptation can matter more than initial strength. In this conflict, Ukraine's emphasis on persistent probing rather than dramatic breakthroughs may represent such a shift. By redefining success as the steady erosion of defensive coherence, Ukraine is reshaping expectations of what progress looks like in a modern, high-intensity war. The geographic scale of the conflict magnifies the impact of this approach. Russia's front line stretches across vast distances, from the eastern industrial regions near the Donbass to southern approaches toward the coast. Maintaining consistent defensive density across such an expanse is inherently difficult. Even minor Ukrainian gains in one sector can force redistributions that ripple across the entire front. The war thus becomes less about holding specific towns and more about maintaining a stable defensive system. When that system begins to show cracks, the strategic implications extend far beyond any single village or trench line. The leadership in both Ukraine and Russia understands that the coming months may determine whether the war remains locked in stalemate or enters a new phase of maneuver. Ukrainian planners appear to be betting that cumulative pressure will eventually create opportunities for larger operational advances. Russian commanders, meanwhile, are attempting to reinforce depth and restore predictability to their defensive network. The outcome will depend not only on tactics, but on logistics, political will, and the ability of each side to sustain its forces through another year of combat. The broader strategic question is whether incremental erosion can produce decisive results. History offers examples of both outcomes. In some conflicts, steady pressure gradually forced the defender into retreat once reserves were exhausted. In others, entrenched lines absorbed years of attrition without collapsing. What distinguishes the current situation is the speed at which information flows and the precision with which even small units can influence the battlefield. In such an environment, the line between tactical and operational effects becomes blurred, as localized actions can trigger wider shifts in posture. Looking ahead, the trajectory of this method suggests that the war may continue to evolve toward a contest of adaptation rather than mass. The side that learns faster, integrates technology more effectively, and maintains cohesion under constant pressure is likely to gain the advantage. Ukraine's current approach indicates an understanding that modern warfare rewards flexibility and persistence over spectacle. Russia's response will reveal whether its military structure can adjust quickly enough to counter this decentralized pressure. Ultimately, the significance of Ukraine's simplest battlefield trick lies not in its novelty, but in its cumulative impact. By turning the war into a constant test of defensive resilience, Ukraine is forcing Russia to expend energy simply to maintain its positions. Each small penetration, each disrupted supply line, each forced redeployment chips away at the assumption that the front can remain stable indefinitely. The war thus shifts from a search for dramatic breakthroughs to a contest over whose system can endure sustained strain. If this pattern continues, the future of the conflict may hinge less on singular offensives and more on the gradual redistribution of initiative. A front line that once seemed fixed could become increasingly fluid, not because of one decisive assault, but because countless small pressures made stability impossible to maintain. In that sense, the simplicity of Ukraine's method may prove to be its greatest strength. It transforms the war from a battle of fortifications into a contest of adaptability, where the side that can continuously adjust holds the strategic advantage. What happens next will depend on whether Russia can restore cohesion faster than Ukraine can erode it. If Russian defense is stabilized, the war may settle again into attritional equilibrium. But if the current pattern accelerates, the cumulative effect could reshape the operational map in ways that neither side initially anticipated. The coming seasons will reveal whether these small cracks in the line remain isolated or expand into fractures capable of altering the trajectory of the war itself.